Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're jumping right into a fascinating and highly critical analysis of a text that literally helped build the modern world. We'll be looking closely at a reading by the author Olavo de Carvalho, which examines Immanuel Kant's famous 1784 essay, What is Enlightenment? The author's work acts as a profound philosophical unmasking. He proposes that just beneath Kant's soaring rhetoric of reason and freedom, there lies a direct, quiet assault on historical Christianity. Okay, let's dive into this. We're essentially going to act as intellectual detectives today, following the author's precise roadmap to unmask a hidden revolution in 18th century philosophy. Our agenda is straightforward. First, the Enlightenment proposal. Then, the logical camouflage, Kant's target, the deposit of faith, and finally, the inversion of time. All right, Section 1, the Enlightenment proposal, the accepted premise. To really understand Carvalho's critique, we have to start with Kant's most famous and, frankly, most widely accepted premise about human reason. Kant writes, Enlightenment is man's emergence from his self-incurred immaturity. Immaturity is the inability to use one's own understanding without the guidance of another. Now, that is an incredibly powerful statement. As the author points out, this appeals directly to our individual conscience. It's a massive call for intellectual independence that requires, above all else, absolute freedom as a precondition just to be able to think for oneself. Section 2, the logical camouflage, finding the anomalies. Now, what's really interesting here is where Carvalho's analysis takes a sharp turn. He identifies a glaring logical anomaly right on the heels of Kant's inspiring rhetoric. You see, Kant introduces a crucial limitation, dividing human reasoning into two very distinct spheres. First, there's the private use of reason. Kant says that when you're a worker or a civil servant, your duty is to simply obey orders to maintain public order. You basically can't question things while you're on the clock. But then there's the public use of reason. Kant argues that outside of work, acting as a scholar, addressing the entire reading public, a person should have total freedom to question absolutely everything. Which immediately brings us to a vital question. How exactly does a common citizen magically become a scholar outside of work hours without any guidance? I mean, if Kant says we must reject the guidance of another, how does a laborer suddenly acquire the erudition needed to address the whole reading public the exact moment their shift ends? According to the author, Olavo de Carvalho, this is a massive logical hole. And Carvalho argues that a highly trained philosopher, a certified genius like Kant, simply wouldn't make such an obvious error by pure accident. So what's going on? Well, Carvalho theorizes that Kant is utilizing a very specific rhetorical strategy here. The author suggests Kant uses a double language to transmit potentially dangerous ideas. These small, almost imperceptible contradictions in the early paragraphs act as kind of anesthetic illogicalities. By presenting them in this calm, moderate tone, Kant effectively numbs the reader's critical faculties. He's preparing us to quietly accept a much, much greater absurdity that he's going to drop later in his essay. This brings us to Section 3, Kant's target, the cleric problem. Once the reader is comfortable, the author notes that Kant increases that anesthetic dose, applying his private versus public logic to a very specific target, the clergy. He applies his rule directly to religious life. Kant suggests that a cleric must teach church doctrine while at work in the pulpit. However, Kant argues that as a scholar speaking to the public outside of the church, this exact same cleric has a total obligation to publicly share all of his doubts and perceived errors regarding those very same doctrines. Carvalho points out the glaring, immediate problem with this. A cleric isn't just an employee working a shift. A cleric is a consecrated soul, dedicated 24 hours a day. Asking a priest or a pastor to publicly broadcast their deepest doubts to the entire world wouldn't foster enlightenment. As Carvalho notes, it would effectively, and quite rapidly, empty the churches. But Kant doesn't stop there. He goes even further, addressing the idea that a group of clerics might swear an oath to uphold a set of unalterable doctrines forever. Kant writes, a contract of this nature, entered into with a view to preventing forever all further enlightenment, is absolutely invalid and null, a crime against human nature. Wow, that is incredibly heavy language. Kant is directly condemning the very idea of an unalterable oath to religious doctrine, labeling it a literal crime against humanity. And this brilliantly illustrates our next point, Section 4, the deposit of faith, the confrontation. Here we see the crux of Carvalho's analysis, an absolute, undeniable collision between Kant's Enlightenment philosophy and ancient Christian theology. To truly measure the apocalyptic consequences of Kant's proposal, the author contrasts Kant's rhetoric directly with the biblical imperative. In Luke 21:33, Jesus says, "Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away." Think about that contrast. Christ commands his followers to hold to an unalterable word. Kant says holding to an unalterable word is a crime against nature. To fully understand the depth of this clash, Carvalho unpacks the Greek theological term paratheke, or deposit. In the Catholic and historical Christian tradition, this is actually a juridical expression. It describes a thing the legitimate owner gives in custody to another, to be conserved and restored completely intact without any modification. According to the author, this is what dogma actually means. It's not something invented by the people who preach it. It is simply given. It's meant to be received, conserved, and transmitted without alteration. A cleric's fundamental, foundational duty is to guard this immutable deposit. So the crucial point is this. Carvalho concludes that Kant knew exactly what he was doing here. By declaring an oath to unalterable doctrine to be invalid and criminal, Kant is fundamentally calling for the criminalization of Christ's own commands. The author powerfully argues that Kant is laying the philosophical groundwork for the extinction of the Church's foundational oath, and ultimately, the total eradication of historical Christianity as an institution that guards a divine deposit. Which brings us to our final synthesis, Section 5, the inversion of time, the grand conclusion. So how does a highly rational philosopher actually justify declaring thousands of years of tradition to be criminal? The author diagnoses a brilliant, if deeply unsettling, structural element in this revolutionary thinking, the inversion of time. Kant imagines this hypothetical perfect future where a perfect state order has fully developed everyone's rational capacity. Now, even though Kant admits this future is highly problematic and maybe even impossible to actually achieve, he still uses this unproven utopian future as the absolute standard and judge for all human conduct. Consequently, the actual historical present and past, including the deeply held dogmas of the Church, are judged against this imaginary future and then condemned as invalid and criminal. Which leaves us with a profound dilemma to consider, based on Olavo de Carvalho's reading of Kant. Can a hypothetical, and perhaps completely impossible, perfect future ever be the rightful judge used to criminalize the realities of our past and present? When we allow a utopian dream to condemn historical reality and immutable dogma, what are the real-world consequences? It's a powerful question about the absolute limits of philosophy and the nature of tradition that continues to echo through our history today. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning and keep seeking to understand the ideas that truly shape our world.